Today, we're going to hear from Dr. Phil Miller. He's going to talk to us about his work with a lecture titled Consilience in Action, Participatory Conservation Planning to Save Endangered Species. Phil and I would like to say we go back a long time, but Phil, we don't go back that far.
All the way back to 2018.
Yeah, all the way back to, it seems like longer since the pandemic.
Yeah, really.
But Phil and I have had the awesome opportunity to work together on some projects involving endangered coastal cetaceans. We've had the benefit of being able to travel the world to Germany, Argentina, to China, to learn more about what's going on. And I got a chance to see in these faraway places Phil Miller step into action in his role as the Senior Program Officer for CPSG, Conservation Planning Specialist Group, which is a part of the IUCN's Species Survival Commission. So Phil has a BS in chemistry from Purdue University, an MS in geology from Northwestern University, a PhD in biology from Arizona State University, and he did his postdoctoral research in conservation genetics at Arizona State University. So he's a collector of degrees and a really awesome guy that I've got a chance to know. And I think you're going to enjoy learning a little bit about his work. Tell you a little bit more about this lecture series in general. We're hoping to bring on a bunch of experts in the fields of conservation and marine mammals to talk more about the types of animals that the Marine Mammal Care Center cares for, but take a step a bit broader, looking at the global view of marine mammal and conservation science, and give everybody those broader perspectives. If you really enjoyed tonight, you want to join us again, keep looking at our social media. We're going to have at least 12 of these coming up in the next few months. So we would love for you all to rejoin us for those future meetings as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Phil to take it on. And if you have any questions during the lecture, feel free to put those into the chat. I'll do my best to answer anything, especially logistical or anything like that you might have. But otherwise, we'll save our questions until the end, and we'll put those in the chat as well, so I can fire those over to Phil, if that sounds okay for everybody. Let's get going.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Dave. I appreciate it. Hey, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. It's fun to kick off the lecture series here. Hopefully, I'll set a good precedent for you, Dave.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it has been a lot of fun working with Dave. Again, going back to a meeting we did in Germany in 2018, and that has spawned a whole collection of work on small cetacean conservation that I'm going to tell you a little bit about tonight. And hopefully once we can start getting on airplanes a little bit more easily, we'll be able to travel to far-flung places and have some good times and get some good work done again. So I really want to thank Dave for the opportunity and the Marine Mammal Care Center as a whole for the opportunity to participate and kick off your lecture series. So I'm going to talk about consilience. I'm going to explain what consilience is, of course, and then I'm going to talk about how we have actually tried to put that into action in a series of conservation planning activities for a whole bunch of different species. But of course, given the audience here, I'm going to be focusing on marine mammal conservation, primarily cetacean conservation, our approach to this concept of consilience, and how we plan on continuing to use it and expand our approach to this idea in the coming years. So I'm really interested in getting any questions and having some conversation around this notion of bringing people together to solve complex conservation problems, because we have a lot of complex problems. And I'm going to give you an example of one of those from the Hong Kong region of coastal China in the Pearl River estuary, which is one of the most heavily industrialized and most densely populated areas on the planet. And it also happens to be home to a really interesting cetacean species called the Chinese white dolphin, also known as the Indo-Pacific humpback dolphin. So this species, again, as Dave said, is one of the many types of nearshore kind of coastal cetaceans that lives in the estuary to the west of Hong Kong here, and then along the waters to both the east and the west of the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region. So this is quite an iconic species for the Hong Kong inhabitants, and also people that live around the different areas surrounding the administrative region. But it's an extremely complicated region that has enormous pressures on the aquatic habitat. There's enormous levels of construction going on in and around Hong Kong. This is on Lantau Island to the west of Hong Kong proper, the diamond right here on the screen. This is Hong Kong International Airport that's being built out into the estuary. So there's enormous construction activity going on. They're driving pilings into the ocean bottom. They are trucking in, as you can see, enormous amounts of material to build the island out into the water. There's enormous noise pollution in the area that causes great stress to the animals, all of the marine animals, in particular the white dolphins in the area, as the ocean is churned up, as the sediment is churned up, as the noise pollution confuses individuals' navigation. They're building a major highway, as identified by this yellow line here, from the airport directly over to the entertainment center on the other side of the estuary called Macau. There's a lot of gambling going on there, a very high density traffic between the two areas. This picture here in the middle, they're building bridges there that, again, necessitates the driving of pilings into the ocean bottom, which kicks up an enormous amount of sediment. That sediment has some of the highest concentrations of organopetrochemicals in the world, and PCBs and other types of contaminants that pose great risks to the individual dolphins, particularly young individuals, as they interact with that now very cloudy and very polluted sediment. And additionally, there's significant high-speed ferry traffic. So these dotted lines here on the map between Hong Kong and areas around Zhuhai and Macau are regions where these high-speed ferries move people in large quantities at high speed across the estuary. They can travel as many as 40, 50 miles an hour. They go so fast, the animals oftentimes can't get out of the way, and there's significant frequencies of boat collisions. Animals get maimed and killed at kind of alarming rates. And in fact, to be a little bit blunt about it, they've actually resorted to trying to understand how to deal with measuring abundance of the population when they find pieces of individuals. Instead of counting whole individuals, they're trying to determine a statistical methodology to figure out if we have various parts of individuals, do they come from the same individual or do they come from separate individuals? So it's a real problem. So this is an enormously complex problem that requires not just knowing what's best for the animal, but knowing how to deal with the intense human pressures that are acting on this landscape in terms of agricultural intensification, transportation intensification, construction, fishing in the areas and fishing bycatch. All sorts of different kind of anthropological problems that require anthropological solutions, right? And this is the same kind of problem that we deal with so many species that are endangered through the impacts of human activities on the landscape. So I have a history, despite my extremely varied and kind of tortured academic history in chemistry and geology and whatever else. My current expertise is in wildlife biology. So I understand what's going on with wildlife. So I work at this part of this diagram, trying to understand how survival and reproduction and habitat availability and distribution affect the growth or decline of wildlife populations. So this is kind of where I'm comfortable in working. But I also need to know the types of activities that go on the landscape that either interact directly with animals, in the forms of illegal hunting or poaching or introduction of disease, or the habitats within which those populations live in terms of the destruction of habitat, fragmentation, degradation, like with the pollution issue that I talked about. So I need to understand how humans act on the landscape in order to be able to understand the impacts of those activities on rates of reproduction and survival of wildlife populations that we're interested in studying. But even more so, I need to understand the kind of human condition in an area that drives people to hunt, that drives people to interact more intensively with wildlife populations, to alter the landscape that is home to so many wildlife populations that we interact with. So as we deal with these really complex conservation problems, we start moving out of our comfort bubble, our kind of intellectual comfort zone, and begin to realize that we need to understand so many other types of bits of information. And we understand then that required knowledge starts expanding almost exponentially when we confront the problems like we have with Chinese white dolphin that are threatening that population with extinction and that species with extinction. If I'm going to help solve that problem and help manage that population or determine the best way to manage that population, I need to understand some of these other disciplines and the information that these other disciplines bring so that I can understand how to fit that information into what I know to be able to gain more insight and more understanding. And that idea, that general idea of unifying knowledge, is what Edward O. Wilson, the classic naturalist and population ecologist of our generation and our century, basically, terms consilience. So consilience is really the unification of knowledge, as I took one of the quotes out of his book. So it's recognizing that we need to understand many different disciplines and understand the need to incorporate different disciplines beyond what we know and what we're comfortable with in order to truly understand the world, understand our place in it, and understand how we might be able to live in greater harmony with it. And so I was fortunate enough over the past 20 years or so in my work with the Conservation Planning Specialist Group to be invited to be a part of an organization of veterinarians and biologists and human demographers and anthropologists and a number of diverse experts in management theory and sociology to become a member of what we call the Biocomplexity Research Network. And that network was essentially trying to take E.O. Wilson's concept of consilience and apply it to wildlife conservation, recognizing the really difficult problems that we have with conservation of wildlife and the need to unify different types of knowledge to be able to solve those problems better. And that work over about a 20-year time span ultimately led to the publication of a book that I was fortunate enough to be involved in editing, where we essentially talk about a various set of experiments that we did to take Wilson's concept of consilience and apply it to a number of different case studies in complex conservation of biodiversity so that we can tell people what we learned, what worked, what didn't work, and the new kinds of things that we might be able to do to improve our ability to save endangered species. And one of the really important things that we understood was there's not only the importance of bringing in different types of science and different types of information, but there's also the importance of getting the right kind of people in the room who have that knowledge and have that expertise and figure out how we can get them to collaborate more effectively. So it's not just, bringing a chemist and a geologist and an ecologist into a room and saying, okay, come up with something interesting and, figure out how to make it work. You actually have to provide the right kinds of tools and processes to get them to exchange information in a way that they can understand how their information fits with other types of information to create a more kind of effective and more synergistic whole. So that is an interesting concept that's related to consilience known as transdisciplinary research. So I'm throwing all sorts of crazy words out, but this notion of transdisciplinarity is really interesting because, historically, at least in the academic world, we're actually rewarded for being experts. We're rewarded for having a kind of, a territory, intellectual territory that we can see as our domain, and we get rewarded for having that expertise in that one field. And in some ways, the notion of collaborating and bringing other kinds of information into what you do is almost a little antithetical to the way that we as academics oftentimes are able to move through our life, right, as professors and as other people within that type of really expert-based work. But this notion of transdisciplinarity goes beyond what we would even consider to be something like a multidisciplinary project or an interdisciplinary project, where you get all those different people together and say, oh yeah, look, I'm bringing all these disciplines together, but the geologist may do their thing, and the ecologist might do their thing, and the sociologist might do their thing, and ne'er the twain may actually, meet, right? So you don't really get that kind of synergy of information that provides, again, that result that is actually greater than the sum of the individual parts that everybody brings to the individual, their individual information as it's brought to the table. So the notion of transdisciplinarity is about really trying to build those bridges between different types of information so that I understand how your information fits into what I do, so that we can actually come up with some new types of questions and new types of ways of thinking that can solve some really complex problems. And this idea is really interesting, and then it actually requires us to kind of sit back and give up some of that territoriality and that sovereignty as identified here in this quote, so that we can really kind of open up and be accepting of other types of information to create a better understanding of a complex system, so that we as a group of interested parties, not just scientists, but also to different people who have a collective stake and a collective commitment to solving the issues in that complex system, we all know how each other thinks, the information that they can bring, so that we can get a better solution to that problem. Moving away from silos and really building bridges is the central kind of theme of this transdisciplinary search for consilience, this unity of knowledge that has really formed the basis of what we do in the conservation planning specialist group. So again, just to put the org chart out there, we're part of this commission known as the Species Survival Commission of the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. So the SSC itself is composed of a number of different specialist groups that I'll talk about in a little bit, but that's the fundamental organization, mostly kind of taxonomically focused. But there are a series of interdisciplinary groups like ours called the Conservation Planning Specialist Group, where we work very closely with the SSC authorities to help implement the SSC's concept of assess, plan, and act. That's really the conservation cycle that the SSC has put forth for the IUCN, this international body of conservation experts involved in everything from species survival to environmental law to social science applications to environmental problems. We at the SSC fundamentally work around this concept of assess, plan, act, where we assess the status of species. We plan for the long-term conservation of those species that have been assessed at particularly high risk of future extinction. And then we work to develop those plans into an achievable, implementable structure that can actually lead to effective action on the ground, so we can improve the status of species in the future. So we're really fundamentally part of the planning element, essentially, of the SSC's activity, and we've developed an increasingly visible leadership role within the SSC to develop that planning component of their cycle. And we also work really closely with a series of specialist groups that are taxonomically focused on a variety of marine mammals. The Cetacean Specialist Group, which was the kind of vehicle through which Dave and I started working together in 2018. We worked with a pinniped specialist group, the Sirenia specialist group, looking at manatees, dugongs, and other types of species. So there's a broad taxonomic scope within the SSC of experts that have particular interest and expertise in a given taxonomic group. And then we work with those organizations to help them identify high priority species for conservation planning, and then work with them to develop those plans for those high priority species to determine what we need to do to mitigate the threats, like we talked about with Chinese white dolphin, so that we can have a better future for those species in the long term after we implement the types of strategies and actions that we help local stakeholders and experts develop around the conservation of that species group. And our organization also focuses and does our work within a concept that we call the one plan approach. where we really look at integrated conservation both inside and outside of its natural range. In other words, we work with wild population conservation. We also work with something called ex situ conservation, which is oftentimes refers to individuals that are kept in everything from zoological parks and aquariums to semi-natural reserves to other types of facilities where they are intensively managed in a semi-natural or partly artificial environment. So there's a range of types of facilities that can work very closely together to cooperate in exchanging individuals or providing individuals from an ex situ environment to release back into the wild to improve the conservation status of that species in the wild. So we work really closely within this concept of including all different types of populations under all different types of intensive or natural management, engaging all the different types of people that need to come to these types of meetings, and all the different types of financial and other types of intellectual resources that need to be brought together. So it's not just a group of scientists sitting in a room together determining what's best for vaquita or Chinese white dolphin or Florida manatees. We're working with everybody from presidents of countries, which we have done in the past for cheetahs in Namibia, to fishermen who are working on, developing their own sustainable fisheries off various coastal regions of the world, to private landowners, to villagers, to anybody that needs to be a part of this workshop process so that they can be a part of the process of identifying what needs to be done for the species so that they can help contribute to the development of the management plan and therefore the implementation of that management plan, which is going to be really important to generate that buy-in from all those people that need to be involved in implementing the plan. So a one plan approach for conservation is really what we strive to achieve. And we've kind of explained this concept a little bit more formally recently in a document that reflects what we call our principles and steps for endangered species conservation planning. This is on our website, cpsg.org. And it really lays out the various kind of principles that we see. We thought about representing these as a tree because the principles really do form the roots. They're the structural foundation of what we do. There are principles that we always abide by. There are kind of non-negotiables when we work on any kind of species problem. And then we also have a series of steps that we engage in that we can modify depending on the, conservation planning, framework that we need to adopt, or the species we're working on, or the country we're working in. But these really form the basis of how we implement these principles and how we make these principles real on the ground when we're helping to facilitate and organize and design and lead a conservation planning process for a given species or set of species in a given country or given habitat or given ecosystem. And those principles really revolve around many of the ideas that I brought forth in this discussion of kind of consilience and transdisciplinarity, right? Not only do we want to make something that's really actionable, that is a real honest to God blueprint for how to work to improve the status of the species, but we, again, in our one plan approach kind of framework, we really promote and encourage inclusive participation from a variety of different disciplines who may not be scientists. They may not even be individuals that have gone through the traditional kind of educational systems that we're more familiar with. They may be villagers that have incredible amounts of knowledge about a species, but it's not in the traditional kind of academic framework that we're used to thinking about when we work to use traditional scientific methods to do this kind of conservation planning. At the same time, we want to bring the best possible science, the best possible information, and the best possible ways of analyzing that information to the process so that we can be as rigorous and as evidence-based in the way that we develop and help our colleagues develop these conservation plans. And we do that through our real close attention to designing a process for bringing people together and working in a very collaborative and interactive and sharing and open way to try to encourage people to provide information and perspectives and feelings around the conservation of the species in the context of what they as human communities and as human groups need for their own particular purposes and for their own survival as well. So we do that through what we call facilitation and process design. How are we going to bring all these different people together and allow them to communicate in a way that's going to be most effective and most productive? And then we're always encouraging these recommendations being made and decisions being made through a real consensus process. So we want everybody to feel like they've at least won something in the development of the plan that is focused on conservation of the species in the context of trying to get everybody to buy into it so they feel like they have won something and therefore be able to be more enthusiastic about helping to implement the actions that have emerged. And then we also want to get these products out quickly so that they can become as useful as possible. And then these documents are always adapting to changing informational systems, as well as changing status of the species and the local communities on the ground too. And then we have a series of steps here that are a little bit more mechanical, but they're really important in thinking about how we understand the overall goal of a conservation planning process, where we want to be at the end of it, what the current system is all about, what is the current status of the species, where is it distributed, what are its threats. Once we know that, we know how and where to intervene in this system so that we can best affect the system and the impacts that the various threats have on that species system as defined by its ability to grow or decline over time, hopefully reduce the likelihood that it's going to decline and increase the likelihood that it's going to grow. And then we can really get down to concrete actions on who's going to do things, how long it's going to take to do, how much it's going to cost, perhaps, who needs to be brought in as collaborators to get that work done, what are going to be the measurable indicators, all of those typical kinds of things that we do in strategic planning so that we can track our progress towards getting something done and seeing the effects of our actions over time. And then really learning and learning what worked in the process, what didn't work, so that we as designers and facilitators working with different colleagues can improve our process so that we can improve the efficacy and the efficiency of our planning process for other species in the future. So this has always been kind of our mantra and kind of our guidebook that we use to do the work that we do. And we've now made that, I think, really effectively transparent in the way that we've described it for people who are interested in perhaps working with us. And we've just had some information come out in the published literature, which has been incredibly exciting for us. One of my colleagues, Caroline Lees, who lives in the UK now, as part of her PhD, she looked at a series of species that we have had active involvement in over the last 20 years or so, and was able to look at, as a group of species, was able to look at whether or not the planning process, whether there's evidence that after our planning process was implemented for those species, whether or not the status of those species, as defined by the IUCN's categorization of status of species known as the red list. We've actually looked to see if there's evidence that the red list status of these species has improved. It's gone to a lower threat level after our workshop process was implemented for that particular species. And the plot on the left-hand side, on the top, shows a total of 20 years of data, where year 0 is when our workshop occurred for any number of any one of the 35 species that are part of this data set that she was able to gather together that had the proper characteristics. And we can see that our kind of control for looking at our effect of conservation planning was to assume that the trend in red list status, where a downward trend is diagnostic of a higher level of threat as defined by the red list index. So if you look 5 years before our workshop process up to the time of the workshop process, we were able to identify Caroline was able to identify that the status of species was declining, continuing to decline over that period of time. And our assumption is known as a counterfactual, is that that population is likely to consider, or that species is likely to continue that same downward trend in status towards a more threatened status, effectively in a linear fashion over time. If we were to look 5, 10, 15 years later, we'd see that group of species continuing to decline in status. And then we were able to look 5, 10, and 15 years after our workshops and actually found that the red list status improved over time for the aggregate group of 35 species. You kind of take the average of the red list status 5, 10, 15 years afterwards. And we were able to demonstrate through Caroline's outstanding work that specifically after 15 years, the average red list status, the average status, conservation status of these taxa actually improved over 10 years. And there's a significant difference in the status of species for which we were involved in this type of conservation planning compared to what you might expect if that type of conservation planning had not occurred. So there's many different ways to do this kind of conservation planning. We believe that our real stakeholder inclusive types of consilience based and transdisciplinary based kind of work is really effective in developing that improvement of status that we see in this diagram. And we're really excited about the ability to demonstrate this and show that this type of planning process that we think can be particularly effective using this kind of stakeholder-based approach can be used more frequently in the future to actually demonstrate a better future for species following our planning involvement. So kind of getting back to coming full circle to the white dolphin exercise, we were brought in by the Ocean Park Conservation Foundation in Hong Kong, Hong Kong Ocean Park, an aquarium there and zoo, and the Associated Conservation Foundation, along with the Hong Kong International Airport Authority, to evaluate the status of the Chinese white dolphin, evaluate the impacts of the different threats that we saw, and that were documented by years of research on the species in the estuary and surrounding regions, and try to help people in the area come up with a conservation plan for the populations that were in and around the Hong Kong area. And we were able to then essentially break the status of these populations down, or the distribution, sorry, of these populations down into 3 different kind of sub-regions around Hong Kong, and then farther down to the kind of eastern part of the estuary and the far western part of the estuary. And we went through a process of gathering information from a diverse array of experts to try to understand what the threats are to the different populations and how those threats vary in intensity across these different populations, so that we can get a sense of the relative vulnerability of these different populations in these different regions and the dolphins therein to these different threats, and how these different threats impact different aspects of the species biology. So we were able to get, admittedly with a high level of uncertainty, because we're looking for information that oftentimes is not available in traditional kind of scientific publications or scientific studies. So we're really relying on information from people such as fishermen in the area, other types of industrial representatives that might have the type of information that we could use to try to characterize the threats, how they impact the different aspects of the species biology, and what the relative impacts of these threats are across different regions of the species distribution. And then we used a variety of different analytical techniques. One is called population viability analysis. It's a computer system. Essentially, it's a computer software that we use to try to predict the future for wildlife populations under different threats. And this is a very central part of what we do in our conservation planning, bringing the science of kind of predictive risk assessment to wildlife conservation planning, bringing in not only the traditional scientific experts, but bringing in experts who have all sorts of information that can help us build a reliable model of the biology of the species, so that we can predict to the best of our ability using this kind of software, how the populations of species will respond to different threats, and then what kind of management is necessary to achieve greater levels of stability for that population under that management. So these tools can help us decide what kind of action to take, how much of it to take, where to implement these different kind of actions, which really gives managers an excellent kind of roadmap as to how to tailor management in order to achieve the best outcome. And we were able to collect a lot of information from a lot of different people for the Chinese white dolphin process to be able to understand how fishing and various other types of boat traffic specifically impact the white dolphins in different areas to help develop some specific recommendations for management of those threats in different regions. And then a little bit more recently, this is where I started meeting Dave and hanging out with him on some of these small cetacean projects that we've been doing. This is the meeting that we first were involved in 2018 in Nuremberg, Germany, where the Nuremberg Zoo and an associated NGO called Yaku Pacha, run by Dr. Lorenzo von Fersen, the gentleman on the far right of the diagram here, or the photo, put together and was gracious enough to host a meeting where we wanted to look at the ways in which ex-situ management, in other words, integrated management using both wild population conservation techniques and perhaps ex-situ or outside the natural range conservation techniques could be integrated together to improve the status of selected cetacean species all over the world. So we brought in a broad array of experts in small cetacean biology, veterinary medicine, conservation planning, ecology, to determine the feasibility of potentially using ex-situ facilities and ex-situ techniques to try to improve the long-term outcome for species that were selected as part of this exercise. And so we were able to bring together a lot of different types of information to determine that largely for most of the species we looked at, we still don't really know enough about how these animals respond to captivity, how they respond to capture, what kinds of medical and veterinary information is required to improve the opportunities for good, healthy animals that can live in those types of ex-situ environments. So it was extremely important to help us prioritize the kinds of information we need to gather in order to better in the future determine how we can utilize these different types of techniques to improve the conservation status of the species, ultimately improve the status of the species in the wild. But we looked at a variety of different taxa during that process that then allowed us to focus some additional work in subsequent years on looking at the conservation needs and the integrated conservation options for selected taxa. One of those was the franciscana, a cetacean species that lives in shallow waters near shore off the coasts of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. And so we met in early November of 2019 to essentially go through that same process, but in a little bit more detail, because in the Germany exercise, we were looking at 7 or 8 taxa simultaneously. This time we were looking just at franciscana to really understand its status in the wild, its status with respect to being able to capture individuals, develop protocols for health screening, for other types of monitoring purposes, both in captive conditions and in wild conditions, and evaluating the relative levels of information that we have available to us to be able to determine how best to use all of the available tools that we have to be able to improve the status of the species in the wild. So there were some really excellent research programs, collaborative research programs between organizations in the US and Europe and South America that were initiated to be able to gather more information on the species to be able to better manage that species across the range of different conditions that it might experience through different levels of management. And then literally about 10 days after that, I think Dave and I came back to our respective homes and did a couple loads of laundry and then hopped back on a plane to China to do a similar type of process for another small cetacean that was a subject of the original Germany workshop, that being the Yangtze River finless porpoise. That meeting was held in Wuhan, China. You may know of Wuhan, China now. I didn't before this meeting, but now everybody knows about Wuhan, China. Interesting timing for this particular meeting, but we were at the Chinese Academy of Sciences Institute of Hydrobiology, where we also were able to, and we had the great opportunity to be able to go out to some areas, what are called semi-natural reserves along the Yangtze River, to observe some of these animals in some of these reserves. As you can see in the upper right-hand portion of the slide there, Grant Abel from the Seattle Aquarium was with us and took some really great shots of these porpoises in what are called semi-natural reserves that are in fact oxbow lakes that have formed right off of the main stem of the Yangtze, which is a typical kind of dynamic ecosystem process along rivers where meanders in the river get occasionally cut off from the main stem and form little lakes that may have some, small connection to the main stem, but otherwise are, fully functional kind of independent bodies of water that are now being used by people within the Chinese Academy of Sciences as essentially reserve populations of dolphins that can number in the hundreds in some areas. So they provide excellent places that essentially are refugia for individuals that would otherwise be threatened by the various kinds of intensive boat traffic threats and water quality threats that are being imposed in the main stem of the Yangtze River itself, and all of the hydroelectric dams that are dotting the landscape along the river system too. So we took some field trips to go out there, evaluate those areas, and then came back to Wuhan to go through a process of listening to a variety of different reports on the status of the species, how we can monitor it, how we keep it in captivity, how we can monitor it more effectively, and think about how to more effectively integrate animals from these semi-natural reserves back into the wild populations once threats to those wild populations have been mitigated to a point where it becomes safer to put those animals back. So we've got a couple of different programs that might be coming online in the next year or two to perhaps look at how we can look at this species in a little bit more detail and apply some of our one plan approach based planning and science-based planning to designing a more holistic and more effective population management scheme for the species as a whole. So this has been a really great set of activities that again began in Germany, moved through Argentina, and then into China, which ultimately really led to, as you can see up in the upper right here, a new team that is formed within the cetacean specialist group that also has input from the conservation planning specialist group, which is being called ICPC, or Integrated Conservation Planning for Cetaceans. So the website there is available. I encourage you to go check it out. It's a really exciting new initiative applying CPSG's one plan approach to prioritizing small cetaceans or cetacean populations for integrated conservation, and then working through a process to determine how best we can implement that type of planning process to design some really effective conservation plans for cetacean populations using in situ techniques, ex situ techniques where appropriate, if appropriate, and then looking at integrating as many different types of knowledge sets and stakeholder perspectives as we can to be able to improve our conservation planning processes. Because remember, this is a really complicated problem to solve. We don't want to wait until it's too late to act decisively to save a species. The photo here, some of you may know, is of a vaquita, one of the last vaquitas that is on the planet in the Gulf of California. This picture was taken, I believe, in October of 2019 by individuals where they were, the individual vaquita was found perilously close to a fishing vessel. Many of you may know that the vaquita is, and Dave can tell you much more about this with much greater levels of perspective and experience and personal involvement. But vaquitas are perilously close to extinction through high levels of fishery interaction, fishery gillnet bycatch interaction. and are the unfortunate casualties of a socioeconomic fishing system that has gone awry, as many of them do, through the extraction of an extremely economically valuable fish from the region known as the totoaba, which is of highly prized in different parts of the world for one of its organs, a swim bladder, and the key to get caught in the nets that are being put out for totoaba. And there are now literally a handful of these individuals left. Intensive action has been undertaken to try to save the species from extinction with varying levels of success. And we've all learned the lesson that we don't want to wait until there are just a handful of individuals in the world to apply these different types of approaches, however integrated those approaches might be, or however consilience based or participatory they might be. If we wait till it's too late, we're not going to be able to bring the species back. So we're learning lessons from these types of activities, and we hope to be able to apply the lessons learned to improve our opportunities to participate in successful species conservation, using all different types of knowledge as unified as we can make it, to save cetacean species around the world and all the different types of wildlife that we so critically depend on in all of our daily lives. So I've really enjoyed working with Dave. I've enjoyed working with the cetacean specialist group and ICPC. I've learned an enormous amount from these folks, and I hope to continue working with y'all in the future as we work towards saving these species from extinction. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all about this. If you want to learn more, you can certainly go to the websites identified here, and I'm more than happy to take some questions and have some conversation. So thanks a lot.
Very cool. Thank you so much, Phil, for all of that really great information and reminding us of all the journeys that we've taken together, which is awesome. We had a couple questions in the chat that I'd like to ask you right now. First question is, it was towards the beginning when you were defining sort of the consilience approach, and basically it sounds like a very long and difficult process. How long does it take to put a plan in place, to get a workshop together, and to get it executed?
Yeah, excellent question. So, I mean, typically, our involvement in these planning projects is always initiated by an external call. We don't comb through the IUCN red list and say, oh, this species looks like it needs some work, and we call the appropriate person. It's always us being consulted and contacted. And I would say from the point of initial contact to the ultimate design and implementation of what might be a series of workshops, depending on the particular situation that we're encountering, I'd say it's not at all unusual to have a good 6 months or so between the initiation of a first contact and the initiation of a workshop, because we want to work hard to collect as much information and assemble as much information as we can on the species and the system of interest, and actually to understand the kind of lay of the land in terms of the different types of stakeholders that are required, so that we can improve the level of participation and expand that level of participation to the appropriate people that need to be there, right? And again, some of those people are hard to contact. Some of those people are hard to get to different places, particularly now in a virtual environment. Some of those people don't have access to the kinds of collaborative online meeting tools that we all share. So it can be a complicated process to get the right kinds of people into the room, and that takes time. So it's a year or so between initiation of a project and the beginnings of developing outputs is not uncommon. But we don't want to rush it. We want to make sure that we get as I showed in that one slide early on, we want to get the science right, and we want to get the right kind of science, and we want to get the participation right. We don't want to have to do this twice unnecessarily. We want to make sure that we kind of measure twice and cut once with respect to the planning process. So it can take a while.
Really quickly, and I think much of your presentation was sort of based on backing up this idea that getting all of those stakeholders and everybody together is the right way to go about doing it. I guess my question to you is, how do you know that this is the right way to go about it? Why not just come in with regs and laws and, tell everybody no, and, preserve the space that way? Why is this a better approach?
Right. Well, without casting aspersion on any other kind of alternative planning process, I guess in some ways, but I mean, I have been involved in and have witnessed and participated in planning processes where an authority will come in and say, we know what to do. We have authority over this system. We're the regulatory agency or the appropriate management agency or the appropriate government agency. We believe that we have the power and the authority and all the knowledge that we need to get this done. So they develop the document without external consultation. And then they produce this document and they hand it to you and say, here's what the US government or the Argentinian government or the French government or whatever it is, or the appropriate French NGO or management agency. Here's what we think you need to do, stakeholders and local people, in order to improve the status of this species. Right, that's the overriding factor. In other words, they're relying solely on science to do the management. And I would argue that that's a nearsighted view, that there is much more information that needs to be brought in that actually allows people to feel like they've actually participated in that planning process. If I'm handed a document from the government that says, here's what you need to do, most of the time I'm going to say, well, it doesn't look like you've included this kind of complexity in the system or that piece of information that this other organization could bring in. And because of that, I don't really feel like you took my information into account or my perspective into account. And as a result, I don't really believe this is the right way to go. And I'm not going to be enthusiastic about participating in it. So I think having that broader participation and that and encouraging that broader level of involvement actually will work better than or at least has greater opportunity for success than this kind of heavy-handed regulatory hammer that is going to be held over people in a way that is not very consilience based.
And definitely we can see that the failure of that approach with vaquita in particular. So we had another question in here about what happens if the species of focus is not a keystone species for the environment? Is there a process of also identifying what the relevant keystone species? So I guess this is broadening us out to think more in terms of ecosystems, right? And sort of the interaction between species. Where does that come into play with one plan approach and all of these?
Yeah, right. I mean, historically, we've had a fairly strong kind of single species approach in line with the kind of historic activities of the Species Survival Commission. But we are, as well as many other organizations, are beginning to look at how to do multi-species planning, in part because we recognize the importance of, broader scale conservation at the kind of ecosystem level, or a kind of habitat assemblage level, and also because we need to get more work done, right? We can't do 70,000, 25,000 or so, 30,000 individual species plans for those taxa that are endangered according to the red list that the IUCN puts out. So we've got to figure out ways to do this on essentially scale up our activity. And we're coming up with a couple of different ways that we can that we can run more species that are within a particular habitat or a particular ecosystem living in a particular area. We've got some ways that we're starting to run more species through slightly higher level planning, not quite at the level of detail that I was showing you with things like franciscana or white dolphins or finless porpoise, but still have can provide real important guidance for how to both prioritize species for more intensive planning, but also look at the needs of an entire assemblage of species across a particular habitat that may be affected by similar threats, or could benefit from particular types of habitat management or species management that can cross-cut a number of different taxa. So we and the SSC as a whole and many other conservation organizations are recognizing the importance of that and beginning to develop particular ways to prioritize species using different types of criteria, and then also running them through these types of multi-species planning processes that can gain greater insight over a broader taxonomic range.
Awesome. We had another question in here specifically about the one plan approach, and how much it involves local community stakeholders. And maybe if you could speak a little bit more about that particular approach and document, and how it's involved in the planning approaches that CPSG takes.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the one plan approach, its most explicit definition is in the context of integrated population management, because we recognized that zoo and aquarium population groups have their own, they develop their own management plans, and wild population organizations develop their own management plans that oftentimes have relatively little effective overlap or interaction, so that the captive population or the zoo and aquarium intensively managed population sometimes contribute relatively little to wild population conservation. So in its kind of purest form, the one plan approach is defined on the basis of that kind of integrated conservation. But you can really think about it in broader terms to have all the different types of stakeholders involved. And by stakeholders, again, I'm talking about local villagers. We've done work in areas such as Papua New Guinea, where we bring in people that are actually engaged in hunting of a variety of highly threatened taxa, to try to understand, not in a judgmental way in any way, shape, or form, of course, but we want to understand why they hunt the way they do, how they hunt the way they do, how has their method of hunting changed over time. Are they finding it more difficult to obtain the kind of meat resources that they need from the various types of targets that they're hunting in their habitats, so that we can understand the intensity of the impact of that activity, and then understand how we can try to manage it in a way that is both beneficial to the resource being hunted as well as to the local villagers, so they still have alternatives to generate protein intake and economic benefits, or whatever the case might be. So that's one of the reasons it takes a while for us to begin to develop a proper process for a conservation planning exercise, because we need to know who needs to be there. And that requires a lot of work on not only understanding who those people are, but how to engage them most effectively to come to one of these meetings. Because a lot of people are like, well, we'll call them up on the phone, or somebody will, and say, hey, we would love for you to come to work on this species in Brazil. And they say, yeah, well, I work on people in Argentina. Why are you talking to me? So again, that's kind of a recognition that there's still almost this kind of like silo thing going on, that we need to be able to articulate the value of bringing these different people in a way that's going to be most effective to solve the complex problems at hand. And that's a challenge, but it's one that we're willing to take, and one that we're willing to continue to improve upon as we do our work.
So you touched on it a little bit. There was another question about, how do you choose what species CPSG is taking on?
Yeah, well, we're masochists in the sense that we say yes to everything. So that makes it difficult for us, but we don't want to say no to anybody. I mean, every species, whether it's a panda in China, or a mountain gorilla in Africa, or a dung beetle in Arkansas, these species are part of the larger system, and they are in need of conservation planning. And regardless of the taxon, regardless of the species, the mere recognition of the value of bringing people together to try to talk about complex problems and have them try to solve them in a collaborative way is reason enough to do this. The more the kind of collaboration we can get between people and the more exchange we can get between people about how we're affecting the planet and how we might want to work together to try to improve that outcome, whether it's for a beetle or a panda, is good enough in our book to actually engage the people that request that kind of activity.
And is there, I guess, more nitty gritty, is there like a form on your website that you fill out, or does it happen through like channels like IUCN, or is it all different ways?
No, we can, there's an email called office@cpsg.org, office@cpsg.org. We get a lot of initial inquiries from that. People will write us and say, I work on the yellow-footed whatnot in Bolivia, and this is an intensely iconic species in the area that is in decline, and we need your help. Would you be willing to talk to us? And it goes on from there, you know? It can be as anonymous as that kind of contact, or it could be with people that we know, that we see in various meetings. People will come to meeting X and they're like, oh, okay, I work on this other species, so maybe I can use you guys for this other species that I work on. So it's word of mouth, and our willingness to get involved in pretty much anything that we think we can handle.
So it's a little bit of everything and everyone in any way.
I'm working on projects, literally everything from butterflies in Canada to wolves in the southeastern US to cranes in South Africa, you know, a little bit of everything. So so it spans the taxonomic gamut.
And as we discussed, you're doing all this work right now from your back porch. In the pandemic. Can you
exactly.
Can you just touch really quickly on how the pandemic has affected your work in particular, and for good or for bad?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, this is my back porch. I live in Minneapolis. So I'm sitting out here on my back porch, which has now become my office since March of 2019. Our job historically, Dave and I have very similar kind of, life experiences with our work. We travel all the time, or at least we did, right? So it's literally, for a while, my daughter thought I lived at the airport, which was a little sad and a little creepy for a while when she was a little kid. But it's an intense kind of a lifestyle when our priority is to work with the local people, right? So I don't want to sit here in Minnesota and write a plan that is going to be used in New Guinea. I want to go to New Guinea and work with the local people. So that requires travel. Pandemic has eliminated travel for us organizationally. So why do all these meetings now wearing this and sitting here? Sometimes with business clothes on, sometimes not, because we now do all these meetings virtually. And I could go on for a long time about this, but there are real pros and cons to it, man. It actually facilitates greater involvement from a larger number of people that may not otherwise be able to travel to meet. But it's complicated to do these things over Zoom, when you're only looking at people in 2D, and half the time you're just looking at their name and not their face on the Zoom call. And it's hard to get people to interact effectively. They go in and out because they've got houses to close on, or they've got teeth to get pulled, or they've got a dog that's peeing on the rug, or whatever it is. It's much more complicated to actually get people to focus in on a conservation problem or a problem of any kind when they're not physically sitting together and they've made the commitment that they need to make to fly somewhere and pay for a hotel and do the work, in the local area. So, and there's more work to be done in designing and facilitating a process that gets people to feel like they're really participating from a virtual, in a virtual space. So it's challenging, but it's something that we all have to work on improving, and we're going to make the best out of it. And our work hasn't slowed down by any means. So we keep cranking away on it and continue to improve our process in a virtual space, as well as in the general process of improving our conservation planning activities. So it's been a real ride, to try to figure out how to work our way through it.
Well, we all appreciate that you're fighting the good fight and still at it. So thank you so much for giving us your talk today and telling us all about how sort of the inner workings of conservation planning. I want to remind everybody that this is going to be an ongoing series of lectures. We'll have more fabulous people just like Phil joining us to talk more about marine mammal science, conservation science, and all of these are going to be brought to us by a really great sponsorship from the Marathon Corporation. They're the ones that make this all possible. So thank you to Phil. We are also recording this, so if you want to share this with somebody else, it'll be up on our website shortly, and we can share that out to everybody who's on here. And I also can send you all an email as well with a link to the recording. So thanks a lot, Phil.
Absolutely.
And we'll see you later.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody,
Appreciate
for joining us.
Yeah, thanks a lot, guys.
Phil, Debbie was asking if you need help for with funds for traveling around the world as well. Do you have a GoFundMe for Phil at your travel account?
Not a bad idea, actually, but you know, that's not a bad idea. We're still, you know, I mean, I feel real fortunate, you know, I mean, I have not had any, you know, haven't had any days of layoff, you know, I mean, we still have our job. We still have a very dedicated donor base, you know, that keeps working with us despite all of the craziness and all the hassles, and it actually has worked out really well. So knock on wood, we're still doing all right.
Still cranking.
Yeah.
All right, lots of thank yous and fantastics and deep bows for helping the world and all of that coming through on the chat.
Right on. Excellent. All right. Well, thanks, everybody.
All right, man. Enjoy your weekend.
All right. Yeah. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye, everybody.